We're right now in the midst of the holiday of Sukkos, and I want to discuss a little bit of the idea of the central mitzvah of the holiday, which is to sit in a sukkah. In fact, that's the name of the holiday. Sukkos, referring to the special Sukkos that we had during the times of the Exodus, and that we reenact every year 5 days after Yom Kippur. So what's the meaning behind this mitzvah, and what does it mean for us, and how could we utilize it and maximize its opportunities? So I want to start with a Gemara, a Talmud, in the book of Avodah Zarah. This is on 2a. And the Gemara starts by talking, it's a very futuristic Gemara, and the Gemara discusses what's going to be sometime in the future when it's time to give reward and punishment for the righteous and the wicked. And the Almighty is going to take a Torah scroll and going to announce whoever studied Torah should come and get the reward. So what's going to happen? Of course, the Jewish people are going to be there, but all the nations of the world are going to come and try to state their claim on Torah and the resulting reward. And there's a very long Gemara back and forth, how each nation is going to try to justify their right to have a portion in Olam Haba, in the world to come, as a result of their actions. And the Ma'is have to negotiate with them back and forth. Very, very long dialogue here, narrative in the Gemara of what's going to be in this futuristic time. Either way, the conclusion of the Gemara is that all the nations are going to be rebutted. Everyone is going to try to make the claim that everything they did was for Torah, when in reality it wasn't for Torah. And then they're going to have one Hail Mary at the end here, and pardon the reference, of just give us one mitzvah, give us one opportunity, give us one option to maybe earn a portion in Olam Haba. And the Almighty is going to say, okay, fine, I'll give you an option. I have an easy mitzvah that you could do, and it's called Sukkah. Go do the mitzvah. It's almost as if the people are so desperate for an opportunity to have Olam Haba that the Almighty is going to suspend the rules and say, fine, I'll give you one mitzvah that you could do. It's the mitzvah of Sukkah. And if you do that, you fulfill that properly, maybe indeed you'll have a portion in Olam Haba. And right away, everyone's going to be so excited. They're going to go run to Home Depot and build a Sukkah on top of their roof. And the Almighty is going to make it so hot and so unbearable that everyone's going to be sitting in the Sukkah and starting to sweat and getting all uncomfortable, that they're going to be so frustrated with this mitzvah that they're going to get out of the Sukkah and give it a kick and go back into the climate-controlled houses. And the Almighty is going to say, you see, these people, they don't like mitzvahs. I gave them a mitzvah. Not only did they not fulfill it, but they left in disdain and disgust. That's the Gemara. So I think it's interesting to note that when the Almighty decided to allow the non-Jews, the non-Jewish nations in the future, to have one opportunity, one mitzvah to demonstrate that they are deserving of Olam Haba, the one mitzvah that they're going to choose is Sukkah. So the truth is, the Gemara addresses that, and the Gemara says that it's an easy mitzvah. It's an easy mitzvah that doesn't cost so much money. If the Almighty said you got to give 10% of the money to charity, well, that's expensive. You got to write a Torah scroll, it costs $50,000 to do that. There's one mitzvah that's cheap, that's Sukkah. But the truth is, there's a lot of mitzvahs that are cheap. You could go visit the sick. How much is the cost to visit the sick? Maybe it's a trip to the hospital to visit the sick. That's a mitzvah in the Torah. To study Torah. That's the greatest mitzvah out there, and that's not so expensive. So there's something important, something different about this mitzvah of Sukkah, that it is deservedly the litmus test to determine the eligibility of people for Olam Haba. So I want to try to crack the code of what is so special about this mitzvah, and I think it's not just relevant in the context of this particular Talmudic narrative. I think it's also relevant for us. We are right now sitting in a sukkah, That's the holiday. There's 7 days that we leave our permanent dwelling and move to the temporary domain of the Sukkah. So if we understood the power behind this mitzvah, I think it would make our celebration, our fulfillment of this mitzvah ever more rewarding. So I want to try to analyze the mitzvah of Sukkah. Let's start with mitzvahs in general. We're told in the Talmud that there's 248 mitzvahs corresponding to 240 limbs and organs of a person. So if you look at a person, you see there's 248 limbs, and each limb has a mitzvah that is related to it. That's what the Talmud says in the book of Makros. That same Talmud says that you could distill all the mitzvahs down to one core idea, and that is faith. Really, it's 248 mitzvahs, and they're all different behaviorisms and different times of the year, and there's Shabbos, and there's holidays, and there's tefillin, etc. But the underpinning core essence of every mitzvah is emunah, is faith in God. Every mitzvah is an expression of faith, and there's 248 mitzvahs / limbs and organs, because there's 248 different acts of faith. What's the idea? The idea is, for someone to have a spiritual completion, they need to create a spiritual replica of themselves. Just like the human body is comprised of 248 limbs, if we want to create a spiritual replica of the human body, then we need to have 248 spiritual limbs. But what's a spiritual limb? A spiritual limb is a mitzvah. Thus, when someone does all 248 mitzvahs, they create a perfect avatar, a spiritual avatar of themselves, and that is who they are spiritually. What happens? Someone dies. What happens to them? Well, their physical iteration ceases to work, and they take the body, it starts decomposing right away, put it in a box, put it in the ground, and now it's food for maggots. That's their physical 248. But their spiritual 248 lives on to the degree that they indeed created that spiritual counterpart with their mitzvos. So indeed, each mitzvah, it's not just, we typically think of mitzvos as just a random collection of godly instructions. The truth is, mitzvahs are perfectly designed to create a spiritual entity that perfectly mirrors who we are here, to create who we are in a spiritual world. And that's, of course, one of the reasons, as a side note, why we can't neglect even a small mitzvah. We have limbs that aren't as important as our heart or our liver, etc. We have more important limbs, and we have a hierarchy of what's really so important and what's not so important. But you talk to people and they say, yeah, maybe my ring toe on my left foot is not so important, but I'm still not willing to give it up. I'm still not willing to have you, God forbid, sever it off my foot. Well, what do you mean it's not so important? Yes, it's not so important, but it's part of me. Every mitzvah is part of me in a spiritual context. That every mitzvah is creating this identity, the spiritual identity. That's who I am. So I cannot neglect a single mitzvah, because neglecting a mitzvah is neglecting part of myself. So what happens? A person does all 248 mitzvahs, and they create all 248 limbs. They get to the spiritual world. Their physical body is being consumed by maggots. So what are they? They are what they created with their mitzvahs. They get to Olam Haba. If they're complete, if they're perfect, if they have all 248 spiritual organs and limbs, then in Olam Haba, the spiritual world, they're complete. If they neglected some mitzvahs, well, unfortunately, they're not complete. If they neglected so many mitzvahs or crucial mitzvahs that someone cannot live without their corresponding organs, well, then they have no portion in Olam Haba. So that's the idea of mitzvahs in general. Mitzvahs are our opportunity to create our spiritual selves. Now, as such, for someone to gain entry to Olam Haba, well, you need to do all 248 mitzvahs. There's no shortcuts, right? You need 248 spiritual limbs. And there's 248 ways to get that one mitzvah per limb. The truth is, the Talmud, and back to the book of Avodah Zarah, it does discuss this notion that it's possible to do this 248 activities all in one. How so? So the Gemara brings three stories. One on Avodah Zarah 10b, one on Avodah Zarah 17a, and one on Avodah Zarah 18a. In each one of these three stories, we find people that may have initially been sinners. Their whole lives, they're sinners. But, three different stories, of course. I don't want to get into the details of the stories. But each one of them had a momentous inspiration, and they made a decision to commit not just themselves on a more minor level, but the entirety of themselves to God. And they all did something, an act of martyrdom, that resulted in their death. And as a result, the Bat Kol, which is a low-level prophecy, announced that these people, they merited to achieve Olam Haba in 1 hour, in 1 minute, with one act. Wait a minute. Didn't you just tell us that you need a minimum of 248 acts to get to Olam Haba unscathed? The answer is correct. Normally, the process that we use to get Olam Haba is mitzvah by mitzvah, building brick by brick, limb by limb, organ by organ, until you have all 248, then you have Olam Haba. What these people did, they didn't do limb by limb, organ by organ, they did all 248 at once. 3 people, 3 episodes, but it demonstrates a concept. And the concept is that it's somehow possible to have a spiritual shortcut to 248. To not say, do one at a time, do all 248 at once. Now, what does our Gemara say? Our Gemara says that the Almighty tells the non-Jews, I have one mitzvah, that if you fulfill this mitzvah properly, you'll merit Olam Haba. Seemingly, this too is a method by which all 248 mitzvahs converge into one, and via observance of one mitzvah, you get Olam Haba. How so? It's interesting that we're told in Jewish sources that there's only a few mitzvahs that incorporate the entirety of one's body. And one of them is a sukkah. You sit in a sukkah. Well, which part of you? Is it your hands? Is it your heart? Is it your arms? Is it your brain? No! It's all 248 limbs of your body are all in the sukkah simultaneously. So I always thought of that idea to be trivia, right? It's something which is interesting. Yeah, there's some mitzvahs that you do with your whole body. So what? But I think in this context of observance of mitzvahs and it creating something special out of the resulting spiritual power of a mitzvah, and now we're told that Sukkah, the mitzvah of Sukkah is a mitzvah you do with all 248 limbs, well, now it makes a lot of sense, or at least the idea is coming a little bit into focus. If you do one mitzvah, but you do it not just with one organ, you do it with all 248 organs, well, maybe it can create, with one mitzvah, the result of 248 mitzvahs in one. But it still doesn't really explain what Sukkah is all about. What about Sukkah gives us this power that it allows a person, or at least potentially, allows a person to achieve everything that results from all the mitzvahs with observance of this one mitzvah? So I want to suggest an idea, how the mitzvah of Sukkah is so foundational and so core to Jewish life that it really has everything in it, all wrapped into one. So we're told in Jewish sources of the more mystical variety that a sukkah is like the shade of faith. We know a sukkah has shade on top. It's got the schach on top. And the resulting shade, that's tzila de mehem nusa. That's shade of faith. Now, that should ring a bell. It's shade of faith, and every mitzvah is an act of faith. So normally you have to do 248 mitzvahs of faith to get Olam Haba. Here, a Godfather offer is extended to the Gentiles to do one mitzvah, to sit in the shade of faith, a mitzvah that incorporates all 248 limbs of a person at once, and thereby skip the tedious and arduous process of collecting mitzvahs one at a time. There's something that intimately links the mitzvah of Sukkah with the idea of faith. What's that? All that was an introduction. Now, here's where we start. Just to impress upon us the value and the power of the holiday, and to have maybe a more meaningful experience next time we sit in a sukkah. So, the Talmud tells us, the very first page of the Talmud in the book of Sukkah really encapsulates the idea of a sukkah. It says like this: we have to sit in a sukkah for 7 days. The Torah tells us, for 7 days, you should leave your permanent dwelling, and you should move into a temporary dwelling. We're told, for 7 days, we have to leave our permanent home, our climate-controlled home, and move into a hut, a primitive hut, for 7 days. Now, if you actually look at a picture of a sukkah, and you Google pictures from substandard living of, tribes in Africa, in third world countries, you'll find that they actually don't look that dissimilar. We're told you have a big, majestic home. It's got all the amenities of modern living, and you have to leave that and go move into a little hut and live in a substandard, or at least third world way of living. What's that message? I want to theorize that this really takes us to the core idea of Jewish life, and of course the core idea of faith. The Mishnah tells us, this world is like a corridor before the next world. Prepare yourself in the corridor so that you may enter the palace. We are dropped into this world without really much of an instruction manual, with the exception of Torah. But we're thrown in the world, and we have zero recollection of our spiritual have. We don't intimately, or at least on a sensory level, connect with our soul. And we're dropped into this world. And we live, some people live a longer life, but on average, Americans live between 70 and 80 years, and then they die, and that's it. That's what we know from living in this world. The Torah tells us that this world is not really an end destination unto its own. It's a corridor, it's a pathway, it's a passageway that we're going to some other world that we call Olam Haba, which means the next world. And here, it's not a world of an ultimate destination. Rather, it's a place to prepare for Olam Haba. So that would be great. The problem is that we have what's called a Yetzer Ra, an evil inclination. And the goal of the evil inclination is to give us a conflicting perspective on life. Whereas the Torah tells us this world, it's only a passageway. It's only a corridor before the next world, which is the real world. The Yetzer Ra gives an entirely different message. He tells us, this world is the only world you've got. Don't think about what's going to happen after you die, because that's not relevant to you. Now your goal is to better your state, your status in this corridor. Don't think about anything beyond this corridor, this world. That's what the Yetzer Ra tells us. So in life, we're conflicted. On one hand, logically we know, everyone knows this, that we're going to die. We haven't met yet the person that lives forever. We know we're going to die. I haven't met yet someone who, maybe you'll live to 110. We can already fathom people living to 120. Let's assume 150 years. But either way, we're just postponing the inevitable and that we're going to die. So logically, we know that whatever investment we do into our status here, well, it has a shelf life. It has a shelf life, and we're rapidly heading towards obsolescence. We're investing in this world, in this iteration of our existence, and we know that we're swiftly reaching the end point, and we can't undo that. That's what we know. But our Yetzer Hara doesn't want us to make that calculation. Our Yetzer Hara wants us to just not ask those kinds of questions. Comes along the Torah and tells us, this world's a corridor for the next world. Your job in the corridor is to prepare for the palace. Now, how do we do that? How do we prepare for Olam Haba? Mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, like we said, a mitzvah is an act of faith that's designed to reorient our thinking regarding this matter. You do a mitzvah. Why do you do a mitzvah? You do a mitzvah because the Almighty tells you to do a mitzvah. Not only that, because a mitzvah is tending to your spiritual half, to your soul, to the part of you that lives beyond your physical death. That's Olam Haba. That's what you're preparing for. Thus, the mitzvah, in essence, is telling us that this world, the world that we're in today with our physical bodies, it's a temporary world. We're not here to stay. We're traveling to our ultimate destination. So what happens when you're traveling? When someone travels, well, then their standards are dropped. Their standards are relaxed. I often say that my couch and my bed are more comfortable than the fanciest 5-star first-class cabin in the world. It's fancier. It's more comfortable. You have more leg room. It's nicer. There's so much room to walk around. So how come people don't pay me $6,000 to crash on my couch every night? Why not? It's more comfortable than those same people would pay for a first-class ticket, which is not as comfortable overnight. What's the difference? The difference is when you're traveling, your standards are relaxed. If you're in transit, you have much lower standards. You're okay. It's remarkable. People, because they want to get to someplace, they don't mind being in a little metal cylinder with hundreds of total strangers sitting in such close proximity that they can smell their body odor, taking a small little satchel, small little package, having to put it with everyone else, having to undergo the humiliation of the security in American airports, eating terrible food for sure the kosher food, of course. But it's just a miserable life. And what do we all do? We'll pay money for it. And the answer is when you're thinking about your destination, you'll put up with a lot. It's not so important. Now you're temporary. You're trying to get towards someplace. You have your eye on the goal, on the destination. If you have your eye on the destination, well, then you're okay with a lot less. And indeed, everything else is going to hinder your progress to your journey. There's a great story with the Chafetz Chaim. He met a wealthy traveling businessman. So someone came, this wealthy person was traveling in Radin, and he came to his house, to the Chafetz Chaim's house. Chafetz Chaim was the great leader of the Jewish community in the 19th and early 20th century. And he came to visit him. This wealthy businessman came to the Chafetz Chaim, and he got to his house. It was a little hovel, and he walked inside, and he couldn't imagine that someone would live in such decrepit conditions. Where's the furniture? The couch got maybe some patches all over it, very sparsely furnished house. So he asked the Chafetz Chaim, where's your furniture? So the Chafetz Chaim asked him, where's your furniture? He says, my furniture? What do you mean? My furniture? They're in my penthouse in Vienna. So he says, well, why don't you have them here? He says, what do you mean? Here I'm traveling. I don't know who brings their furniture when they're traveling. He says, I'm also traveling. My furniture is in my permanent home. Here's my temporary home. This is a powerful, foundational lesson of life. That is, that what we are over here, in this world that we're in, that all of us are in right now, we really view that as we're traveling. We're traveling. It's not our ultimate home. So we have a permanent home. But is it really permanent? Don't we know that we're not going to live forever? I'm almost 30 years old. So let's say I live for another 100 years. 100 years is a lot of time. But it's still temporary. Right? It's not permanent. It's not permanent. So even my permanent home, it's just more temporary. It's a longer journey. Maybe it's not a flight across the Atlantic. Maybe it's a trip in a ship across the Atlantic. But it's still a trip. It's still temporary. Now the Yetzer Hara dupes us with his distortionary tactics into making the mistake of thinking that our permanent home is really permanent. But the truth is, logically, and certainly the Torah's perspective, is that, yes, it may be slightly more permanent than the sukkah that we have outside, but it's just varying degrees of temporality. This is permanent. This is temporary. The sukkah that we're in, the house is also temporary. And the truth is we're all going to die. And what happens when we die? Then what is exposed? Our soul, which is indeed permanent, that's exposed. Thus, what's really striking and remarkable, according to this, is that we have a tendency of focusing and investing in our temporary self, but neglecting our permanent self. Man is a fusion of a temporary body and a permanent soul. Problem is we're not aware of it. Of course, that's the Yetzer Hara. But from the Torah's perspective, and certainly logically it makes sense to us, our body and our physical iteration, well, that's temporary. Our soul is permanent. Yet, we have a tendency to ignore our soul, to ignore our actual permanent iteration in favor of investing exclusively in our temporary existence. And that is really devastating when you think about it, to invest in a temporary venture is on its own questionable. I like to say this example. Imagine, now we have climate change. So in some places in the world, the seas are expanding, and therefore the beaches are getting smaller. So imagine someone comes with you an offer and says, I have this beachfront property. You can build a beautiful summer home, beautiful vacation home. It's the nicest beach, pristine water, the best sand, everything. So you say, it sounds like a great idea. And you know what? It is a great idea. Problem is, this is not mentioned. Every year, the water, the tides get a few feet closer. And within a couple of years, your house is actually underwater. You can build a nice, beautiful home, but all it will be is a nice coral reef for some fishies to come swim in your game room, in your basement. That's what's going to happen. So does it make sense for someone to invest lots of money to build a house? Well, they'll have a beautiful vacation home. Yes, for 5 years, 6 years, maybe 7. Maybe you could push it to 10 years. But afterwards, it's underwater. It's totally underwater. Well, it would be insane to make that investment. But there's more. Let's say someone says, I'm going to make that investment anyhow. I'm going to invest in a temporary dwelling. I'm going to invest in it. But wouldn't it be asinine and preposterous for someone to say, I'll invest in the temporary, but I'll neglect the permanent? Imagine, today, people, they like to put orthodontics, they got to go to the orthodontist, and they get braces. They straighten their teeth. I have never seen anyone that puts braces on baby teeth. I've never seen it. baby teeth, I guess in general, come out a little bit straighter than permanent teeth for whatever reason. But I've never seen a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old with crooked baby teeth that the parents or someone decided to put on braces on them. I've never seen that before. But I can imagine sometime in the future that maybe we'll become a little bit more vain and people would start putting braces on baby teeth. I can imagine that happening. Fine. But it would be absurd to put braces on baby teeth and not put them on permanent teeth. If you're going to invest in something temporary, you should surely invest in something permanent. But the truth is that even our permanent teeth aren't so permanent, but it's more permanent. But our soul, well, that's entirely permanent. And we could go through life investing and investing and investing in the temporary and neglecting the permanent. And I think this is the lesson of the holiday. The lesson of the holiday of Sukkos, it's really a 7-day exercise of leaving our permanent home, moving out of our permanent dwelling, and moving in to temporary dwelling. Why would someone do that? Why would someone downgrade their standard of living? It doesn't make any sense. And the truth is that according to the halacha, ideally we should be sleeping in the sukkah. Everything you do in your house, we should be moving our computers and all the amenities of our home should really be moved into our sukkah. We should really live in our sukkah the same way we live in our house. Now, what's the point? The lesson is that it reminds us that we have to further not only our temporary life, but our permanent life as well. And the truth is, this could be a little bit disheartening. This whole notion that a lot of what we're doing in our life is an exercise in futility, it could be a little bit disturbing. It's a little bit unsettling to think about the fact that we are investing so much in our temporary lives. That indeed is maybe it's a good lesson to have, but it is a little bit unsettling. But I think that I want to look at it on the positive sense. I think it's inspiring and heartwarming and refreshing that our soul and our consciousness, well, that lives forever. That is permanent. What a legacy. How inspiring is it to know that when someone dies, they're not over and done with. It's not just a race to the finish line. We're going to fall off the cliff and just be forgotten and black out nothing. We can create an eternal legacy. We can't live forever with the power of our soul. But that is dependent. All that hinges on our capacity to actually prepare in the temporary world for the permanent world. If we don't prepare in the corridor, we won't be ready when the time arrives for entering the palace. The truth is, we have a house, we have a sukkah. It's just different grades of temporality. One maybe is our house for 7 days. One is our house for 70 years. But both of them are temporary. However, we have an indestructible soul. You can maybe, God forbid, shoot a Jew, but you cannot vanquish his spirit. No matter how gory or grisly someone's death is, their soul lives on. So we're sitting in a temporary dwelling, and we remind ourselves that our lives over here are also temporary, but our soul is not temporary. We have one temporary entity, one permanent entity, and it's prudent for us to invest as much as we can in our permanent and view our temporary entity in the proper perspective to ensure that it doesn't jeopardize our permanent life as well. As such, perhaps we can say that the sukkah does represent a core value of Judaism. Really, this is what it's all about. This is the goal of all the mitzvahs. This is what faith is. Faith is the recognition of God and its implications for our life, and the awareness of the soul, and awareness of afterlife, and living with that as a guiding light. Well, that's what faith is. Thus, we can say that, yes, sitting in a temporary existence here, well, that's an act of faith. To recognize that your existence here that's an act of faith. What happens? The Imani says to the Gentiles, you want Olam Haba? Fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah. So they get into the Sukkah, and what happens? It's hot. From Houston, Texas, where we are right now, it's not so hard to imagine being in a hot Sukkah. It gets 90 degrees, maybe even hotter sometimes in Sukkahs. And the sun's beating down on you. And while you're supposed to have the schach that gives you shade, there's still some elements of sun that are able to permeate their way through. And it's uncomfortable. And you're getting hot and getting irritable. But the truth is, we realize that it's temporary. We're traveling. Sometimes when you travel, it's not the most comfortable. It's not the most comfortable circumstances. Our family, we drive to Canada every year in the summer. So think about that. You're in a minivan with a family. Thank God we have a big, beautiful family. But to travel in a minivan 1,700 miles to Canada, that's insane. You're suffering. But in your head, you're thinking, 1,700 miles, but now it's 1,600 miles, and now it's 1,500 miles, and we're moving, and we're traveling, we're getting there. It's not going to be forever. This is temporary. If it's temporary, well, then you can bear it. If to live like that forever, oh gosh, that would be difficult. But if it's just temporary, well, then you could be okay with that. So the Gentiles are given an opportunity. They're given an opportunity to go sit in the sukkah and to go demonstrate that this world is temporary. By demonstrating this world is temporary, they're able to stamp their golden ticket to Olam Haba. And they get there, and you know what? It gets a little uncomfortable. And they get out, and they kick the sukkah. They could not bear the notion that this world is temporary. They couldn't handle it. To them, they didn't realize that they were traveling. They thought that this is the way it's always going to be. They couldn't wrap their heads around the notion that that this is a temporary life, a temporary existence. To them, if it's permanent, well, how could you manage? Could you imagine living outside the whole year in the elements? No one can imagine that. If it's 7 days or 70 years in our proverbial example of a temporary life, well, okay, you could put up with a lot more. They were so influenced by the Yetzer Hara's ideology that this world is permanent, that the difficulty, the suffering was too much to bear. They couldn't handle it. They got out. They hit the sukkah, and you know what? As a result, if you're not able to view this world as temporary, if you only look at this world as permanent, what's going to be when you actually get to the permanent world? You've already had your permanent world. You've committed to the notion that the temporary world, our world, is permanent. You weren't living. You didn't prepare yourself in the temporary world for the permanent world. Well, you get to the permanent world and you have no portion. So it's interesting what the holiday is and what the implications are. And we could see how it has such far-reaching consequences. And I was thinking, just to conclude here, that the truth is we have another holiday which is precisely 6 months after Sukkot, and that's the holiday of Passover. And Passover also shares the same lesson. The mitzvah of Passover, of course, is the mitzvah of matzah. What's matzah? Matzah is the most basic food you could possibly imagine. Flour, water, and nothing else. If you add yeast to the matzah concoction, what do you have? You have chametz. You cannot have that on Passover. Says the Talmud, the Yetzer Hara, the nickname for the Yetzer Hara, se'or shebe'isa, yeast in the bread. What the Yetzer Hara does, he takes a temporary life and turns it into something permanent. He takes a means and turns it into an ends. He takes a passageway and turns it into a destination. How so? He takes the matzah, which is matzah you need. You need to have when you're traveling, when you're going along this corridor to Olam Haba, you need to have food, or else you won't survive. But the Yetzer Hara injects the yeast into the bread. He turns the flat and uninspiring matzah into the fluffy and delectable and exciting bread. And the difference between matzah and bread is that matzah that's temporary food. That's food that you would only exist, that you would only ingest if you wanted its sustenance and nutrition. That's the only reason why you would do that. Well, if you're here temporary, if you're here with the eye on the destination, then you're okay with airplane food. It's airplane food. You just need the food to get to your destination. What happens? He says, no, you have to have gourmet food. You have to have the best kind of food in the world. Why? Because, well, you're not going to eat airplane food in your house. I don't know. People do that, maybe. I don't know. I'm sure there's someone who does that, who takes the airplane food and brings it home. Maybe. But for most of us, well, now we're in our permanent home. I'm not going to eat the airplane food. Well, but if life is really this airplane travel to Olam Haba, you have to remember that. You have to every once in a while have a 7-day holiday where all you're eating is airplane food. And they have another 7-day holiday exactly half a year later where you're moving into a temporary hut. And thus, really, these two holidays are bookends of the year to keep us in focus, to keep us remembering what life is really all about. And if nothing else works, says the Talmud, you got to remember that we're temporary. We're not going to live forever. Clearly, and the truth is, everyone would never to ask themselves, do you know anyone that's lived forever? No, it hasn't happened yet. We're all going to die. Thinking about our own death, that reminds us of our temporality. When you remember your temporality, hopefully, you'll think, how do I invest in my permanent self, in my soul? How do I access greatness? Not just over here in my temporary existence, but in my permanent existence as well. That's what we're doing with the Sukkah. And the hope is that we can take this secret of Sukkah that we unlocked from the Talmud and benefit from it ourselves. Of course, this futuristic narrative the Talmud tells us is really relevant to us. When we're sitting on the Sukkah, we have to realize what we're doing, what an opportunity we have to reframe our perspective and our values and our priorities in this world, and to ensure that we view this world as a corridor before the next world and reap all the benefits that result.